But for people who are just entering into this conversation psychedelically or Jewishly, there is a lot of interest in getting really quick into Jewish mysticism.
Right.
And people don't always know the on ramp for that. So maybe could you talk about what is mysticism generally and
Right.
what is Jewish mysticism
So
specifically?
I'm going to backtrack because you asked me what do I remember, as if it was outside the system. But in the end, like maybe be more specific now that I think about what you're really asking. I wound up doing my dissertation in mysticism at Fordham University.
Right.
My advisor, Ewart Cousins, was part of the Good Friday experiment. All the
As a
people
participant?
as a participant.
Uh huh.
He was one of those newly people who renounced being a priest and in 62 and then wound up getting into this sort of stuff. And he then went off to an Indian reservation to experience Native American spirituality. And he had a program at Fordham in mysticism. So, therefore, a lot of the Catholic professors, Protestant members, were in some way part of the Good Friday or some other connection to Punk's research.
Yeah.
Know that from the research of masters in Houston on the four levels of psychic experience and Stanislav Grof, they came to
Hmm.
visit our program. We did mysticism with, Gene Houston showing up in the class to disrupt it.
Wow.
The program took us through field trips to see the Jung Center so we understand how to interpret archetypes. Is a pre-web age. You actually had to go to a center and they had files. What does this archetype mean?
Wow.
Um, and the classics of Western spirituality were being edited out of Fordham, meaning Ewart Cousins was the editor. And that was that turn to mysticism post Good Friday experience, post the changes of the 60s and 70s.
Mhm.
And that's really, you know, to give you some grounding before we get to the specifics, that was my
Yes.
graduate program. So
Okay. You were
unlike
in the womb of it all.
yeah, so unlike most Jewish graduate programs that regardless of how the participants got there, at that
Hmm.
point turned incredibly historic and philological. Our program, Cousins believed that mysticism was about the psychological journey through stages, about the mind's ascent into mystic structures. It's about the archetypes. And yes, it was historic and critical, but it was not. The program was a very different sort of program, and it attracted different sorts of people.
So what then after your encounter in that time, which feels like deeply experiential, you're in contact with the people who are not only kind of at the forefront of the study of mysticism, comparative mysticism, but also of psychedelic psychotherapy. Now, in your teaching and in your research and writing, what what would you say then is, if there is, everything that you learned about mysticism in your program and since then, how does it actually relate to entheogenic drugs in any way?
So at that point, I mean, in some way we're reproducing old debates. This should
Hmm.
have been settled 40 years ago.
Settle it for us now.
Okay. So, know all the people, whether punk masters, um, I don't know, huge, list of people who did experiments, who did it from a psychological, um, from a healing, from a social work, from a mystical, from history, all came out and showed that there's an overlap of experience. The the dissenting voice was a scholar at Oxford by the name of Zahner, who put out, I think, 4 or 5 books saying that there was no overlap between mysticism and the use of drugs. But you look at the books today and they don't really say that because there used to be this concept called mysticism, in which mysticism meant unio mystica, and it's the same for all people and all cultures. And therefore, whether you are taking nitrous oxide or you have a great spiritual experience of a sunset, or you meditate and you reach a state, or you're a great saint or a Rinpoche, it's all the same.
Hmm.
So Zahner spent several books arguing that whatever you're experiencing with the drugs is not the same as John of the Cross. It's not the same as Shankara. But the point is, so everyone said, good. So that's not what the issue is. The fact that you take a 8-week course in Buddhist meditation and you get some sort of um, mindfulness and oneness experience, or Zen, at that time Zen was in, you have a sense of some sort of satori from a summer program in Zen. That doesn't make you into the master. You don't become the leader by doing that. But at that point, there was a real confusion. There was a book also put out by Stace, who argued philosophically that all mysticism is the same, and
Hmm.
it was pretty much nonsense, because anybody who was doing psychology in the '60s, '70s, into the '80s showed there are dozens of experiences on many different levels. Even in the end, Zahner was saying that himself. But if you take a premise that all mysticism is the same, then drugs have got to be very different. But once you now assume there are many levels of experience, then that's great. It will open you up. You'll definitely experience something. You can compare it to a summertime meditation class. You can compare it to alcohol. You can compare it to many things and proceed with it.
According to you now, that the subjective experience of a either short-lived, whether it's spontaneous or something that is cultivated over time, um, ability to achieve expanded consciousness is not materially similar to a drug-induced, a psychoactive induced experience of expanded consciousness.
No, I'm not saying it's different materially. I mean, now you can do, whether you want to do brain, now you can do, MRIs and CAT scans. You can show quite a bit of overlap, but that
Hmm.
doesn't make you. That doesn't mean how far you are.
So something about experience and authority.
It's not authority. It's also how you view. I mean, the one that I usually use in class to explain it
Hmm.
is they did Rorschach's tests. You could have an experience, and you're going to see something in the Rorschach's test, like everyone else. When you start getting that sense of oneness of being, that spirituality oneness, you start seeing the same Rorschach's test as jazz musicians and other creative beings. You've reached a certain stage and the drugs got you there. But like as Groff said, you could do this through breath work. You could do this through lots of means. And then we see the next levels. We now see the Rorschach's test going overly simple, that you've
Hmm.
blocked everything out and it's less creative and fun, but you've now in some way put on much more blinders to the rest of the world.
Coming back to maybe the contemporary psychedelic renaissance, if you will, um, it seems to me that a good amount of the frameworks that researchers often use with regards to mystical experience, either the mystical experience questionnaire or the Hood scale, or assertions about how mystical experiences can be occasioned um, by particular psychoactive materials, and here are all of the qualities that make up a mystical experience. Does it does that mean that they're maybe using um, outdated information? They're using outdated frameworks that have kind of maybe been updated but not applied.
So I think a lot of people are not speaking to each other.
Hmm.
First of all, the ayahuasca experiences and the new books coming out all, go into shamanic language. which
Hmm.
is not the same as mystical language. I don't think whether the shaman, the ayahuasca, and a number of things that bring involuntary visions are the same as the Ramak, Moshe Cordovero, telling you he's going up to the clouds of the unfeeling. Okay. Or to put in
Hmm.
other terms, there's some scholars in California, Walsh and Company, who've, actually, shown you can just differentiate, by blood pressure rate, by voluntary, involuntary. And if you want, you can speak completely clinical. But the very fact that we now have shamanic categories and mystical categories and oneness categories and creative categories, your program was run by William Richards, right?
Yeah, Bill. Yeah.
Okay, Bill. So Bill in his book, point blank, is going to say there are people who have, yeah, I assume, yeah, thank you. Very clear. There are people who have experiences of wholeness and oneness, then experiences of positive mood and doors, then separate from doors of perception,
Hmm.
separate than disillusion of the self, separate than archetypal visions. The mystical was a funny Protestant category created by William James once upon a time with incredibly, you know, very, very Protestant alone to the alone terms that make no sense. I mean, just once we're on this already, I was teaching to a class of Hindu and Buddhist students. Most of the Buddhist students had spent years in a monastery meditating. And I taught them William James. And they taught me even stronger how William James makes no sense. First
Hmm.
of all, it's not alone to the alone. You need a guru. You need a path. You need someone who's showing you what to do. You need training. It's like any athletics. It needs the ascesis, the training of an athlete, in order to do it. That's just what in Buddhist. That's from their Buddhist monastery point of view. And these were, Thai Buddhists. This is not people who just took a week. These were, people who are going now for a graduate degree in religion because they're going to be leaders. And so they're taking me and they're telling me how wrong James says in everything he's saying. So it's coming out of that. The word mysticism is really coming from the world of James. It has Quaker, it has liberal Protestant roots. It's not, when I even teach Jewish mysticism, one of the first texts I'll do after doing James, let's define our terms, is I then do Julian of Norwich, in which you're now going to get this incredibly painful, bloody, embodied vision that is not in any way like James. And then I'll do something like, depending on the year, the Besh's Ascent into heaven, where he speaks to all the heavenly. Also, nothing to do with James. And there's no reason to use that same word. And we trip on that word when you ask me, what does it have to do with mysticism? I have no idea what you're talking about.
Hmm.
Remember, going back to Stace wrote this book, and it was very influential on Zahner and others, is that
Yeah.
it's all the same. I have
Right.
taught Hindus and Buddhists. I've taught it in India. I've lectured Kabbalah in the Tantra centers in India. I've taught Hindus and Muslims in Indonesia. This is not just my sitting back. This is
Yes,
really
of course.
interchange with them. And we now have a huge variety of visions, dreams, disillusion of the self, feelings of well being, magidim, visualization, lights, this huge realm of experiences, which
Right.
used to be called altered states of consciousness. The book by Charles Tart and Daniel Goldman somehow fell out of fashion, but they got it much more right. They were even just sitting back as Jews in New England post the post the psychedelic era, saying, look, our options of Zen and our options of Vipassana and our options of Gurdjieff and going to dance with the Sufis are not all the same. There's a variety of altered states of consciousness. And therefore, does it overlap with drugs? 100%.
So let's imagine that either you were in the position or that there are psychedelic researchers who are listening right now. And what you've shared is about the multiplicity of altered states or expanded states of consciousness and not narrowing down to stasis or William James's very limited categories of these experiences. First of all, what would you call it? Would you want to ditch the word mysticism? And how would you maybe start to measure people's experiences without some universal categories? Is it possible?
So I think everybody would measure in their own terms, meaning the neurobiologist does one way, the psychologist another way, the biopsychologist another way, the historian of mysticism another way, the anthropologist, but then they all have to then speak to each other, and then you're bringing back, now that it's being used in medical things, bring all the data together. I'm not sure. I mean, in some way, Tart and Goldman did a better job of bringing together everything then than anybody now. So the question is, I do think it should be measured. It's not my field to measure it in the scientific ways.
Of course.
It is my way to be teaching mysticism and comparative mysticism around the world. I taught comparative mysticism, and we still use that word in Indonesia. Once again, almost nothing of the Jameses category played any role in the classroom because everybody in Indonesia believes in some sort of Sufi animism to reality, some sort of everything is infused with the divine. They believe in a oneness of reality. They believed in Sufi saints, and let's go up at midnight to pray there. And none of that really fits into this classic word. I then in Bali or Varanasi, I've experienced all these different senses, and I'm not going to look to put it all into one category as much as a variety, because even Bill in his book says, look, I'm going to use the word spirituality rather than mysticism or religious, because that's what people use now, but we can all agree that there's more than one word that could be used. There's a variety of experiences. Here's my data. Look at all the stuff I produced. I'll tell you that from being in the field, speaking to people around the world. There's lots of experiences. We used to distinguish between the mystical and the shamanic, for example,
Mm-hmm.
which in some way, if you want to put it, in some way, it's, now we'll include the meditative or the contemplative as a third category. And so I'm not going to see it as all one. And I do think some experiences could have qualities of more than one.
So maybe we can shift our focus a little bit. You've already opened up the possibility or maybe the reality of the varieties of experience, inner experience, but maybe dropping down to the major states of consciousness. Of course, there's a myriad, but some major states of consciousness that we find in Jewish sacred literature, mystical or otherwise, that maybe a Jewish psychedelic explorer would want to familiarize themselves with from the literature and then maybe to understand their direct experience in those terms if they so choose.
It's a good question. The quickest answer I would give, let's say, or backtrack, if we think about Baba Ramdas,
Hmm.
he didn't know what he was doing. He found the Tibetan Book of the Dead with Tim Leary and company. They completely misread it. They did not know what to make of it. Yeah,
There it is right there.
they misread it. They had no idea that it's a magical text to really be read over the dead body in a funeral. It wasn't, but it was the only source they're getting of all of archetypal imagery and disillusion of the self. So there's a lot I could say on that. On one hand, If you wanted a quick answer for people who are not even going to listen to the end of this, I would start and take, for the archetypal, I would take Howard Schwartz's Tree of Souls. Here's a rather, midrashic, kabbalistic. Here are all the archetypes of demons, trees of life, dragons, and all sorts of things from visions. And read Aryeh Kaplan's meditation on the Kabbalah, which gives an overview of more than 2 dozen different types of experience that was written in conjunction with psychologists, because he
Hmm.
gathered a group post the first psychedelic era, in which all the psychologists had on some level some experience. They were old. They were already a little older at that point. And that's who he thought he was going to understand mysticism with, not the historians, the philologists, but with the psychologists. And therefore, that's one of the few books, Meditation on the Kabbalah, that presents Kabbalah from a psychological, experiential point of view. But things that one should know about: you should know about Jewish meditation techniques, kavanot also. You should know about a sense of light, shar hakavana, mekubalim rishonim. You should know about Abulafia's deautomation techniques. You should know Hasidic sense of higher and lower unities and sense of mindfulness. Tzavat Harivash, someone should have made that into a mindfulness text years ago. All of it plays a role. You need to know the meditation, the contemplation, the de-automation, the sense of well-being in text. You need to know the myth and symbol, Jewish views of Leviathan, demons, angels, from the interpret experiences. The Jewish Book of the Dead, Ma'avir Yavok by Aaron Berechia, has never been translated or even
Hmm.
partially translated, because here it's talking about the dissolution of the self and into death, and then you come to lower and higher states of afterlife. And the question is not empirically, how do they know? Are they just making this up? That's not the issue, but it's giving you this rich Jewish language of the Jewish Book of the Dead, like most cultures have around the world, in which that is the language and the imagery and the symbols that are rather archetypal for Jews.
Can we pause on just that one
Yeah.
particular work? So, something that I see often in psychedelic work, psychedelic text, psychedelic media, um, is the ascendance of achieving ego death. Right, that's the one of the best possible outcomes of one's psychedelic engagement, is for the ego to die. Would you say that the way that is spoken about now, that is similar to the sense in this text that you're describing, or is it something completely different?
So this text is all of the above. It's ego death and it's archetypal visions of, you know, otherworldly beings, and it's opening doors to new perceptions of revelation. It's a mixture of many different things.
Hmm.
One thing is, you keep saying like this is the ideal, but at the same time, Bill Richards himself gives you, but in the end, there's this huge number of things, and I'm just going to put it in, I forgot, 4 or 5 chapters of different types of things that people do get in his research.
Absolutely. I mean, I am not of the opinion that the ego death is the height of any particular experience, but just one of the particular experiences that a person could encounter. And if
Yeah,
they do, then how are they prepared for
right.
such a thing?
There are
Yeah.
Hasidic texts that involve both hitpashtura gashmiut, being divestment of corporeality, the ascetic moving beyond the body, and into the ego death, in which in which you turn the human yesh into an ayin, into a nothing, and it's there. And in some way, we should have called this out 40 years ago, and created practices, and we should have created Jewish ashrams, meaning the pasna and mindfulness is not really Buddhism. I've met Buddhists around the world. Real Buddhists are, keep holidays. Or there's actually a monastery that just started in New Jersey. They only eat. They don't eat after midday. They are celibate. They don't have possessions. They don't use social media. They are looking for a good rebirth. It's not
Hmm.
psychological, but they want a good rebirth, and they want their followers to support them and bring them food. Now through online, you make contributions to what they need, and you're going to earn merit that way. That's the traditional Theravada system. Whatever then became our modern forms of Buddhism in Burma and Thailand and elsewhere first simplified it to meditation. And then Thich Nhat Hanh even didn't went beyond Vipassana and basically said mindfulness. There are so many mindful techniques, even just in a simple text like the Tzavat HaRivash, what's called the Testament of the Baal Shem Tov. Certain things of always keep God in mind, keep the letters in mind, just things that you would be mindful. And we should have created something like that long ago. It's not about everyone returning, because there's something about Jews doing a switch and bait. We'll teach you this for 8 weeks, and then we want to then completely bring you into the system. The Buddhists never did that. They never said, okay, now we're going to make you into a Buddhist. We're just going to teach you more and more techniques. The overwhelming majority of people don't get beyond the first level, the mindfulness or the basic watching your breath. I mean, the overwhelming majority, not to say that people don't go on. And it would have been, we would have now, here's the Jewish meditation technique that everybody would have known, or variety of techniques. And it would have been a contribution.
Well, hopefully we're on the way in some way, but I want to go back to what you were saying about the techniques, the mindful techniques, the daily practice. You've described just this rich treasure house of all of these states of consciousness that we find throughout Jewish sacred literature. But I'm wondering if, and we had an exchange about this maybe a year ago, if there is something akin to what we call integration now, psychedelic integration. Whatever we have encountered in these states of consciousness, then we are trying to find ways of bringing them back, grounding, anchoring what we have encountered, what we have seen, what the insight that we have gained, the noetic quality of knowledge. Are there techniques akin, alike integration that we find in these traditions as well, or is there something else happening after someone has had this profound, expansive experience?
I don't think there's any spiritual tradition that's not about integration. That's
Mm.
really being on the path. There's an old mystical metaphor of, you can't just collect pearls and put them in the drawer unless you string them into a piece of jewelry. You don't have a piece of jewelry. Also, you need the string of pearls, not individual pearls in the drawer. So all paths are about integration, development. You have to take experiences and put them onto a path, of which there are different paths, because different paths will then emphasize different elements, even if biologically, socially, and linguistically we will have some of the same experiences, but you will certainly understand it differently. I've taught a class of mixed Buddhists and Hindus in India. I've taught a
Hmm.
class of mixed Muslims and Hindus in Indonesia. You know, and you watch this in front of you, and people emphasize different qualities within experiences. A Vipassana path is very different than a tantric Kashmir Shaivist path. Not that they're unrelated, but there'll be an overlap. The path of the Ramak, or is the Ramak in what Kaplan calls early schools, is going to be different than the Ari and Chaim Vital, is different than Abulafia. Not that there's not an overlap, meaning Abulafia will clearly think the highest levels are things like seeing a projected double.
Yeah. Autoscopy.
Right, oh, Scott, right.
Yeah.
And which occurs quite common. It's
Hmm.
quite common if you're doing mystical techniques, altered states of consciousness, but it doesn't play any role in many other. It doesn't play a role in others. For others, it's about reaching some sort of state of oneness beyond categories, and that's not the Abulafia category. They're related. They're even textually created. Cordovero read Abulafia. I mean, there's overlaps here, but that's not the same that they're all the same integration path. And that's why my class in India laughed at William James. Without a guru, what are you talking about? So if you want to know specifics, for example, Rav Kalanimus Kalman Shapira, the Piaseczna, who is very in right now,
Yeah.
says that if you don't have a clear path of spiritual growing, you're not spiritual growing. And he gives lots of metaphors because he was teaching youth, about the need for roads or tracks. That unless you're getting from point A and know where you're not going anywhere. You could have lots of experiences, and the Piaseczna could take you there, meaning he can, do something and say, we're now going to do this. We're now going to do this practice or this practice or this practice. And some of them are actually being taught, the quieting technique or some of the others that the Piaseczna taught. But the Piaseczna himself said you need to integrate it into a path. And we don't really do that now, whether in various Jewish programs, it doesn't really play a role. There's no real even sense that there are paths.
Well, so then let me ask you. So I have been in contact with so many different kinds of Jewish psychedelic explorers of various ages, affiliations, denominations, um, different levels of Jewish commitment, understandings of their own identity, and often whether someone is from or someone has had no formal Jewish education and is underserved by the Jewish institutional community. There is a strong urgency after a psychedelic experience, after a vision of divinity or encountering the oneness of reality, uh, encountering one's death. They want to know what to do with that with some urgency, but the way that our Jewish spiritual infrastructure exists currently in North America, at least for liberal and secular minded Jews, there is no on ramp to these practices or to teachers that will accept them regardless of their halachic commitment. So I'm trying to diagnose the problem, and I'm trying to maybe wonder with you what would be something that you would suggest for these folks just to get those exposed roots into the ground.
Well, I think the problem's much worse than you say.
Okay.
Because once again, when we look at the Buddhist categories, they completely don't even give you, they don't even really are, their goal is not even to get you into the institutional Buddhism. And, the most important, how to keep festivals and how to make daily offerings. And, almost anyone who goes off to learn, let's say, Buddhism really has no even understanding that the Buddha has to be on a platform, there has to be a hollow underneath. You have to keep changing the water in front of it. If there's a crack in the statue, then it's not an invalid statue.
Hmm.
Here we have people who meditate and mix freely Hindu Buddhist symbols without any realize that they're real halachot of these religions and real prayer times and offering times and festivals. That part of the attraction of Buddhist modernism is they really created something that could be attractive to people who don't want to take on the traditional Thai, Burmese, Chinese, Japanese, Korean lives.
Hmm.
Like I said, we should have done that for Judaism. We should have had some institution where you could say, here is some sort of, here are the various, paths. Here is the sort of Sufi duty of the heart path. Here is the, a Zikri Sefer Haredim path. Here's a Musar path. Here is a Chabad mystical path, in which you can actually go to teachers who will continue you on the mystical path. We lost an opportunity. Even now, I don't really see anyone doing it. We create, unfortunately, people really just tend to want a workshop. Here's 8 weeks or whatever they want, or a week. No one really wants now a teacher that's now you're going to listen to and really take you on the journey like all the other traditions. I know my Catholic colleagues all have retreat centers. Not all of them are particularly doing well because people don't want to go to retreat centers. But in the retreat centers is where Catholics used to do either the Ignatian path or the Benedictine path. And you would do it as part of your upbringing. You would do it, instead of like Jews will do a gap year or studying somewhere, Catholics used to go to this as part of their formation, regardless of whether they then became a doctor, lawyer, or fireman or whatever they became. We really don't have it. And I think that if we're talking out loud to each other, I can't
Mm-hmm.
emphasize enough the need for it.
Mm.
Not as some sort of just here's a spectrum of people on a panel telling you about paths at a limud or a conference, but a
Mm.
place where you actually go in and actually, do it for a, 10-month commitment.
Yeah, I often I use the language or the imagery of the difference between the menu and the meal. That we are often being served the menu and mistaking it for the meal itself. So how do we actually create the opportunities? How do we gather the resources? How do we commit to uh, actually teaching these things with teachers who know what they're talking about and are ready to bring on lots of different types of students? Um, we're obviously not there yet, but I do feel that the urgency that psychedelic explorers often feel could be enough to motivate such a movement. So I guess
So
we'll see.
I think in the Zoom age, it's much easier now to organize something like that,
Yeah.
and you can create some sort of program. There were many people who started doing that in the early 2000s. No, I don't know if any of those programs are still active. There are a number of individuals who are still teaching privately meditation, and people will take it for Jewish meditation for 8 weeks. But a real program of, people get very distracted into other things. I'm not going to mention all the names of people who had little programs of various sorts 20 years ago. But it really be someone who thinks that this is important right now, and to provide translations, just so people can then, read the literature so they know even a sense of being brought into it, of where to go.
Well, I want to again maybe drill down a little bit deeper and more specific. So we've covered major expressions of Jewish mystical or spiritual states. What could be considered uh, an integration path where people are right now with regard to the desire to be on a path and the lack of options, at least for this early generation. Um, but we do have in our tradition, we do have an occasion once a year to shift consciousness using a psychoactive substance for the express purpose, at least one express purpose, of dissolving boundaries between some particular types of binaries, right? And this holiday is Purim, or Chodesh Tov, by the way. It's Adar now, and the drinking of wine, at least as it's described in the Gemara in Tanit, is for the purpose of coming to adaloyada consciousness, until one does not know consciousness. Um, could you talk a little bit about what is the meaning and purpose of this particular uh, opportunity of shifting consciousness, either in mystical literature or otherwise? Because it seems like um, an excellent model for how we can think about shifting consciousness with psychoactive substances
Hmm.
the rest of the year.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a start, the middle, broad, and then I'm going to get down to Jewish texts. Um, so the fact is, medieval literature understood there's a commonality between alcohol, hashish, music, dance, ecstatic joy. All of them play a role. And in literature, it was called the problem of sama, that you're hearing from outside. It's in Al Ghazali, which was translated into Hebrew. Jews knew this issue of what's the status of Sama. So we're reinventing the wheel. The medievals all understood that alcohol and drugs can bring you to God, but they understood it was a stage on the way. And also to frame it before we go further, the
Please.
Mittler Rebbe, the son of the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, wrote a book called Tract on Ecstasy,
Mhm.
Kuntres Palut. And it actually got translated by Louis Jacobs, one of the few real mystical map guidelines of 10 stages of merging into God. And in there, he talks about alcohol. And he basically says alcohol is hearing from afar. It's still external. You haven't mastered the merger because you go up and you come back down. Or any drug, you go up and you come back down. So it only goes to what he calls of the 10 stages, five external, five internal. It gets you only up to whether the second or third of the external stages. But understand that if you really have a map and a training and you know where you're going, it does play an incredible role.
Hmm.
Now to the question. The Maharal of Prague, a 16th century thinker, actually says what you want it to say, that adalo yada, till you don't know the difference, is actually reaching a deeper state of consciousness. You reach a deeper point than the intellect. You reach a stage of oneness. And in the Maharal, that's getting back to your preface. It's getting back to you in the womb. It's getting back to a place before our persona and masks. And therefore, on Purim is the one day when you reach that secret place that you can do that, and therefore you do get truly drunk on Purim. And anybody who is in that tradition of Maharal, which would include Hasidic groups
Mhm.
like Chabad who read the Maharal, would say similar things. I once had a student in an Orthodox institution who wrote a paper for one of the journals on the Maharal and the Maharal tradition about how you have really got to reach an altered state on Purim. And that seems to be the meaning. Understand that all the modern Orthodox rabbis went ballistic. This is not true. It doesn't say that. Um, Even if he did say it, he doesn't mean it. It can't be. Judaism is about rational. It's against intoxication. It's about this worldly intellect, Talmudic legal logic, same logic you go to law school with, but it's there. The opposite extreme, there was, I don't know how much of it's been published, a little bit came out in English. There was a Chabad influencer at the first half of the 20th century called Rav Mendel Futerfas, who actually wrote all of these like um, homilies or sermons about the importance of vodka because it's clear. It brings the clear light of the divine. It gives you a sense of God's oneness. Unless you touch God's oneness through the vodka, uh, you're never going to then be able to go to the more internal stages.
So With the encountering of Adelo Yada, regardless of the interpretation, I guess I'm also interested then, is this something to be integrated for the rest of the year? Is this something that is singularly focused in this point? How do and the Maharal and others
So
then begin to talk
that
about that?
becomes your tradition, meaning, if with the Maharal, it's either once a year, or a Futterfass, it's every Verbrengen, every week,
Hmm.
and you're someplace in between. So I can't give a real answer. And at this point, I don't drink anymore for medical reasons that doesn't agree anymore. But I teach, for example, I teach a Zohar class once a week locally, and one of the people who shows up is a liver surgeon, and not only does he not drink, he actually encourages the other people there who do bring bottles not to drink, because as a liver surgeon, he's not a particular fan of drinking at this point. So at this point, we've got to reach a balance that means something within a given path.
I want to maybe zoom out again now that we've kind of hit uh, our Purim line, but I'm interested also. Then you were talking about states of consciousness as if they are true and real. I'm always interested in the role of doubt and skepticism, whether it is with regards to the epistemic knowledge of a psychedelic experience or even our religious and spiritual experiences. Could you talk about maybe the role of doubt or questioning our experiences, especially when, with regard to psychedelics, I think there's a feeling that this was true and real, and I must continue to act as if. Yeah, please.
So let's deal with it first of all. Is to put it into a context. Whether it's hearing from afar or sama. It all both has an effect, and at the same time, you have to figure out what did it speak to you.
Hmm.
Usually, you're asking about what does it mean. Usually, the question is, what does it mean? What does the message you take from it? So, there's a book called um, "Responsa from Heaven." There was a medieval rabbi who used to ask questions to heaven, dream questions. And in there, you can see he's not naive and trusting everything he dreams. At one point, he then asked the same question a second time, a third time, saying, "How do I know you're real? How do I know you're not deceiving me? How can I trust my experiences? How can I trust my dream?" And after he has it three times in a row, then he trusts it. But at the same time, if you read it from our perspective, why is he trusting it? Because it kept coming back.
Hmm.
Two, because, I mean, the same answer. Two, it was judged as correct by other criteria by himself. That fits in what I know elsewhere. It wasn't telling him something wild. Three, he shared it with those around him, and they
Hmm.
gave him the certain feedback to, yes, this is, after three times, and you're saying, is this a demon? This is a false vision. This time it's going to be real. You look at what it is. We have other Jewish mystical texts that will be asking, how do I know whether something I experienced is it real or demonic?
Hmm.
And once again, they would say it's real because I did this, this, and this, and this person instructed me, and it matches what else I know. And then it becomes a certain insult that you give to others. Your experience is demonic, mine is real. But there is that criteria that it wasn't seen as, you can see in the texts themselves that record experiences. They're not just saying, "Oh, I know that I experienced this, and therefore I'm a simpleton and I'm going to take it at face value." It
Hmm.
really, they then question the content, they question the means,
Hmm.
they question, and then by the end, there's usually these process, and it's usually the same in each case. They know how they got there. It fits in with what else they know. They've shared it with others. It's useful for them.
So would you say then, just to say it succinctly, that um, these experiences confer new insight into old information, but require some sort of external confirmation?
Well, that goes back to my Buddhist and Hindu students who laughed at William James, saying, without your guru, how do you know what's real and what's not real? How do you know
Hmm.
what you should be cultivating and what you're focusing on?" Now,
Hmm.
I'm not saying we've got to adapt that social structure, but there is some sense of, I mean, a lot of us do all sorts of athletic trainings or medical procedures, and you touch base whoever's telling you what to do with whether it worked right or not. People have tennis instructors and swimming instructors and golf instructors, and your doctor tells you use this machine or take this regiment, and you definitely touch base. There has to be some sort of mechanism by which to touch base, even through, call me in 3 months and let's talk about it, or a support, or this America, small groups, working groups in which you pool your knowledge.
Yeah, I think one of the people who articulates this best and most consistently is a guy named Joshua Schrei from the Emerald podcast. Are you familiar?
Okay. No.
Yeah, I think you would love it. But talking about traditional indigenous cultures, whether they are using psychoactive substances or um, are specifically focused on the practices which cultivate trance states, um, that the trance state of the individual is always integrated into the myth of the collective and interpreted by the elders. And so, in that way, there is an individual experience, but it's always absorbed into the greater whole. And this, in some way, then allows people to probably achieve some sort of equilibrium, um, right? That the balance between the new insight and the old information with the external confirmation. And I think in this atomized and individualized culture, uh, especially with psychedelic experience, that when there is no myth to ground one's direct experience, it might actually be quite dysregulating.
Okay. So I hear three different questions there.
Yeah, I've got a lot of them.
So, on one hand, the problem that bothered them in the 70s was the problem with people like Charles Manson, who
Hmm.
took LSD and then commits mass murder.
Right.
So, that's one problem, which we're not going to talk about today because that's not what you're asking. But understand that they obsessed on that issue once upon a time. Two is, what do you have the people who are just not part of a path and don't know how to do it? You're thinking of this as the alone to the alone. You don't know what to trust. How much of this is mixed with your own bad relationship with family and parents and whatever projections and regressions you have, which is problem number two. And problem number three is that we have no collective tradition for this at this point. The alcohol becomes one in which is a collective tradition.
Hmm.
If you had a mashpia, an Hasidic influencer who integrated for you, we're now going to have a farbrengen, and you're going to drink quite a bit, and we're going to talk about God, that the world is an illusion, and you're going to come out with a sense that I am God and you are God, and we're all one, and that's perfectly fine and fits in a certain role within your spiritual growth that allows you to go back to the text. But without any sort of collective image, you don't have the same. There are many parts of the Zohar that could be a great. I mean, right now I'm going through the introduction, which is not a quote unquote Kabbalistic spherotic text. It's about meeting Elijah on the beach. It's having dreams. It's having visions. It's about all sorts of insights. It's about the underworld. It's about the higher Garden of Eden. in which people experience and come and go, and it's a language. That could certainly be the sort of serving text to build something on. But right now, there is no current popular tradition outside of very, very narrow, usually ultra orthodox small circles,
Hmm.
or neo Hasidic small religious Zionist circles. Very little of that.
Well, I want to come back to someone that you mentioned when we first began speaking, Houston Smith. Um, if there's a quote attributed to him, and I think it's probably a paraphrase of something he said in Cleansing the Doors of Perception, um, about the fact that we've been speaking about altered states quite a bit, but wanting to understand from your perspective, what does it mean to take an altered state and actually translate it into an altered trait?
I was once on a panel with him back in my right after graduate school. I mean, I've still been in graduate school. My advisor, and when we had a panel dealing with these sort of states a long
Hmm.
time ago,
Hmm.
and so Houston had a very clear view of, there are certain virtues this is supposed to cultivate. And that's part of it. A lot of people will get involved in this. And, they stay the same. It falls away. They become the same jerks that they always were. And clinically, we show people are just going to go back to being the same jerks. If there's no actual tradition that's now going to cultivate our oneness, compassion, selflessness, then you're going to fall back. And Houston Smith believed that that was a certain core of religious life, less focused on questions of revelation, less focused on doctrine issues, but the fact that cultivation of those spiritual virtues is really what it's about. And he, really liked, spiritual religious communities across the world. He also experienced a lot of them in all different countries in all different ways. He was a wandering, I believe, Methodist as much
Hmm.
as I'm a wandering Jew on experiencing this all over the world. There are people who, come down and say that's really what it's about, doing this. There are many people who used to be involved with the Siva Foundation who, after
Hmm.
both taking psychedelics and having experienced India, coming back that it's about helping the poor and the doing service. And but you need those organizations, not just you're going to give tzedakah to the federation. That's not what this is about. That's not going to create a certain virtue within you.
So I guess this question about altered states to achieving altered traits, I think maybe a word for that as well is just healing, that psychedelics are being shared with regards to individual and collective healing. Do we also see that in Jewish mystical and spiritual traditions as well?
So one, all experiences, whether mystical or psychedelic or alcohol, can go both ways. For some people, it can mess them up, and some people, it can be healing. And that becomes part of the context and content and all sorts of things that play a role within it. If the healing, certainly now there are several psychologists who are using this for healing, but within it, you now have the mystical experience is now letting you take on what is called Musar HaKabbali, the Kabbalistic ethic of the selflessness, of the helping others. You meet many who are really quite spiritual, quite on the path, who will really help everybody, who will put themselves out for others. It's not part of our modern making of the modern Jew. It's really not, but you will certainly see it there once again. You will see various more pious Hasidic groups, the ones you don't usually encounter, who really do have a healing ethos. You will see it, and certainly within the texts, I find things like Cordevero's Tomar Devora, an incredibly healing text, but we don't teach it enough. That becomes the role now of turning this into a musar, to an ethical path, which a lot of people don't really. want to go that route, to going beyond their materialism and spiritual materialism. That those are all issues that play a role here, but I think it needs to be done. I think a true institution that you may build, would be somebody who's always bringing this back down. Someone may give you the path for the experiences, but somebody else may always then say, let's now bring that back to the compassion, the service meanings of these things. We also use healing in more than one sense, because of the difference between now selfless service for others and saying healing, you're for those who believe in the collective trauma of the Jewish people post Holocaust and that we have to heal it collectively. That's a different sort of healing.
Well, maybe we can speak about that another time. But Alan Brill, thank you so much for your wisdom and insight and your brilliance. And I'm grateful for your ability to guide this generation of Jewish psychedelic explorers back to their own traditions.
Well, you're doing all the work. I thank you.
All right. Chodesh Tov.
I just have